All right, gang, let's make sure we got this working. If you can hear my voice after.
All right, gang, let's make sure we got this.
Okay. Sorry. You're going to see a bunch of things go back and forth here. All right, guys, so we have a huge delay. You're going to hear a little bit of reverb, I think, because I had to mute. Yeah, I can hear it on the stream. All right, so it should be better in a moment. All right, so there's a lot of delay, more than the normal 7 seconds. Yeah, sure. How's the mic volume now?
Sure. How's the mic volume now? Sure. How's the mic volume now?
How's this? That should be better.
All right, gang, let's make sure. How's this? That should be.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, right now, tell me if you hear me or not. Okay, perfect. All right, I had to mute my end of things because otherwise I was getting a massive reverb where it was going through this, through my speakers, back at me, and no good. So, good. That should work then. All right, so there's a big delay. So between you guys chatting and me, you hearing my response, it's a good 10 seconds. Okay. Victoria, why? Oh, you're good. Okay, all right, fine. All right, so I'm gonna scroll up the list. Keep putting stuff on the list if you like. That's fine. Let's see. Someone wants me to go over all of China from the beginning to the end. I'm not doing that. That'll take a course. Um, but if you pick a 200-year chunk, I'll do my best. Let me start by saying this. Remember the test. Forget the course. The test only tests from 1200 CE to modern day. That's it. Anything before 1200 is not tested unless it's considered foundational, meaning major world religions, major world philosophies. So Confucianism is on the board, Christianity is on the board, etc. Those is the foundation of Islam. That's all available. However, without a doubt, they don't test material on anything before 1200 CE. Okay, so that should be a big help right there because that at least narrow that stuff down. All right. It looks like there's a bunch of stuff asked about China throughout, so we'll do some of that. But I'll be honest, we did a lot of that in class. I mean, you might think you're not confident, but frankly, you're not qualified to know whether or not you should be confident. Only I am. Ray asks, how do we do DBQs? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'd like to take all the writing questions and I like to hold them for another night. The reason why I'm saying that is I have you doing that writing assignment tonight that you should have done. I'd rather you look at what we're going to do in class tomorrow, see the results of this, how did it work out, what works, what doesn't work, and how to sort of adjust it. So let's make one night coming up, maybe Thursday, we'll make it just writing. Okay, so let's just hold off all the writing questions for now. They're good questions, but let's just hold off on them. Let's just do content tonight, and we'll do the writing and the skill stuff on Thursday night, okay? Because that's a little bit, I'd rather have some examples from class to show or talk about so we can actually reference something. All right. Can we do Taiping and Box Rebellion quick? Yeah, we can. So let's just remember kind of the 1800s in China in general were a total crap storm for the Chinese. For one, the empire is in about its 150th year of rule or so from the Qing dynasty. The Qing are Manchu warrior nomads that swept into China at the close of the Ming and have conquered the place and have run it ever since. And like most major empires, they start on a very strong upward slope where they're doing a great job organizing government, centralizing government. The early Qing had a number of rebellions, but they survived them. And by certainly in the 1700s, the Qing are strong. They are a stable, strong society. But always with a very angry Chinese, Han Chinese underclass who doesn't like the fact that Manchus are running China, right? We know that. Okay, so fast forward to the arrival of the Europeans. First, you get the Portuguese, who tried to sort of blast their way into China the same way they tried to do with India. It doesn't work. In those days, now remember, this is early now. You're talking like, 1600, 1500. You're talking Ming era, actually. The Chinese defeat the Portuguese, actually, in a naval battle. And the Portuguese are forced to kind of settle on the rights to lease that swampland that becomes Macau, if you recall, and that becomes a European trade hub in China. Technically speaking, Europeans were allowed to travel up the coast more or less freely and trade in any Chinese city that they wanted to. They always chose Canton, modern Guangzhou, because it was the closest, but they theoretically could have gone anywhere at that time, as long as they were trading in silver, right? We know that. Eventually, the Qing take over, and one of their reforms for European trade is to go, look, the Chinese are too damn savage. The European barbarians are too savage to be allowed in really the Chinese court. They don't follow proper protocol, so we're just going to keep them isolated to Canton by rule. That's the Canton system. And that sets up the opium trade. If you recall, British East India Company is going to take its holdings in India. It's going to force Indian farmers to move away from crops that are food crops and instead start growing poppy. This will allow them to sell the poppy plants to Indian businesses, which will turn the poppy and its sap and its resins into opium. This makes the British East India Company squeaky clean when it comes to who's actually selling drugs. They're just selling flowers, right? And then the Indians, these Indian businesses, will sell that resin to licensed subcontracted ships and fleets that are sailing with a cut of the profits going to the British East India Company, and these are your China traders / your smugglers. These are people from all sorts of countries. You got British, you got American, you got Scottish. We talked about Jardine Matheson as a good example of that. They sail the product, the opium, into Chinese waters, into the harbors outside Canton, sell it to Chinese drug dealers themselves. Those drug dealers pay in silver. The smugglers sail their boats into Canton Harbor with holds full of silver, Chinese silver, and then turn around and buy the tea, the porcelain, and whatever else they want, bribing Chinese merchants and Chinese officials locally along the way in order to ensure that nobody really sort of asks any questions as where'd you get all this Chinese silver from, right? When that's done, they bring it back to the British East India Company, and then they sell it back in Europe. And this is the opium trade. That opium trade will continue until 1839, when you have the Opium War, the first one. The British win it easily. There's a second Opium War in 1842. The British win that easily. The net result of these Opium Wars is that you have two treaties, but basically you can wrap them up into a thing called the Treaty of Nanking, sometimes called the Treaty of Nanjing, depends on which system of Chinese you're using to translate out of. But basically, the treaty guarantees the rights of extraterritoriality, which is that Europeans, especially British, will not be tried in Chinese courts for infractions of Chinese law. So if you're a European and you break a law in China, you are responsible for what you've done, but you'll not be tried in a Chinese court, you'll be tried in a British court. How many British citizens do you think were convicted of doing crimes in China in British courts? Let's count. 0, or near enough to. Most importantly, for the British, they seized the island of Hong Kong as part of their takings from the war, and that allows them to establish the Hong Kong harbor, which becomes sovereign British territory. They no longer are like the Portuguese reliant on renting land that the Chinese supervise in Macau. This is British territory. And from that point forward, English and honestly European influence in China grows and grows and grows economically. This sets the stage for the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion, if you recall, was led by an actual lunatic who thought, after failing the Confucian civil service exams and probably having something like a mental breakdown, that he was the brother of the actual Jesus Christ. We went through this. He actually thought he was Jesus' brother, and that he was going to bring a Christian kingdom to China. As we talked about, he ran a brutal regime in South China for like 13 years. He took the southern Chinese capital of Nanjing and conquered it, held it as his capital. We talked about how he tried to negotiate with the Europeans as sort of to get them to help him become the next emperor of China, basically ask them to use their armies to unseat the Qing. His argument being this will make the Chinese people happy. I'm Chinese. Remember, he really wasn't. He was a Hakka, which is like a minority group in China, but there's certainly more Chinese than the Manchus from, sort of like a hierarchy standpoint. But the Europeans walked away feeling like, no, this dude ain't Christian. He's psycho. And they actually helped the Qing government suppress the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was devastating. You cannot have a half of your most productive parts of China in perpetual civil war or under control of a religious zealot nutjob cult that is actively brutalizing the people under its regime and expect that your government's going to walk away from that unscathed. This demonstrated to the Europeans and to the Chinese that the Qing were actually pretty weak. On reputation terms, the Qing were seen as this like overlord force of unstoppable warriors, but that was only true 250 years before that. In the current time we're talking about, the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, that wasn't true anymore. So with the Taiping, eventually the Taiping kingdom defeated, China's now set up for its next problem. For about the next 20, 30 years, nothing super serious happens in China because European attention turns to Africa. The scramble for Africa, remember, is that 1885, 1890 sort of time frame. So you got the end of the Taiping Rebellion, and there's a bit of a gap before you get the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxer Rebellion is the early 1900s, so I'm going to say 1905. You can look it up if you want. And what basically happens there is the Europeans come under the targeting of another group of religious this is common in China, that you have a group of a religious sect show up and start trying to overthrow the government is extremely common in China. And these guys decide to target Europeans as their main target. But they also viewed all foreigners as a danger, and they viewed the Manchus as foreigners, right? The rulers as foreigners. We talked about how one of their original goals was to unseat the Manchu government. You'll notice that's a common trend here. Not surprising. They're foreign invaders to China. They're not popular. However, the last Qing empress, Xi ends up negotiating with the Boxers in secret, convinces them that actually what they want to do is get rid of the foreigners only, and that really together they can forge a proper China once the foreigners are gone. This led to the Boxers turning completely on European settlements, which existed in large numbers at this point, particularly around the Yangtze River Valley. The Boxers would attack settlements of Europeans, behead them. Really brutal stuff. All in the name of sort of freeing China from foreign influence. Anyway, so they're defeated eventually because the Europeans, of course, band together. They bring a big army, a multinational army, into China, boots on the ground, and they defeat the Boxers. They find out pretty quickly that the Empress was actually behind this, and once the Empress figures out she's been had, she throws Qing imperial troops in the mix to try to support the Boxers, and you have actual full war between basically the Qing with the Boxers versus the Europeans. The Europeans win easily. It's a technological mismatch. It's just not going to happen. And they seize Beijing. Now, something might have come of that more dramatically, if not for the fact that European attention is quickly drawn back to Europe, because you had the lead up to World War I. Because this is all happening right around 1910, 1908. So what happens in China from there is there's a series of revolts that eventually lead to the last Qing emperor being dethroned and a supposed Chinese republic coming into place that doesn't last. And China ends up in a series of various warlords fighting over different chunks of the country, basically right up to the point where the Japanese invade China for natural resources, but we'll pause that story there. All right, so that's Taiping and Boxer, Safavid, Abbasid. I thought I saw somebody said Dar al-Islam. Throw in the Ottomans while you're at it. Sure, just all of Islam. What the hell? Just toss it in there. And the Mughals. Yeah, you really got the whole thing. All right. So, Dar al-Islam is the piece of Islam. That's it, the world of Islam. It is the notion of that Islamic social project we talked about. How Islam is a unique religion. Because unlike every other major world religion, which were all started by pardon my expression, losers, but they were. Jesus was crucified. The Jews were persecuted and ostracized and scattered across Europe. Their kingdoms destroyed. The Buddha was literally died a nobody, a hermit. Confucius died a nobody, a failure. We talked about how most major religious figures and philosophical figures actually are failures in their own lives. They don't actually get to recognize what they've accomplished. Islam was different. Islam was led by what was a merchant who became a warlord, who became a king. That's very, very different. And he set up a rule set, and that rule set was what he said was the rules. They're never changing. They're the rules. That's fine if you're a 600 CE-ish desert Arabian warlord and your rules are for desert Arabs to live in the deserts of Arabia. It's a little bit different when you conquer Syria, you conquer Palestine, you conquer Jerusalem, you conquer what is modern Jordan, you conquer North Africa, you conquer hunks of the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire. Well, now what the hell do you do? The rules of Islam don't apply very well. In fact, the second you move beyond owning like a city or two, your growing kingdom, now empire, well, your merchant turned warlord turned king didn't have rules for what to do. Didn't have rules for how to keep a postal service working. Didn't tell you what to do. So they had to figure it out. So the Dar al-Islam is this broader notion that there is an Islamic social project put in place by Muhammad, that the goal of Islam is to spread Islam to the world. And that as elements of the world become, what's the word I want to use, annexed by the Islamic project, they join in the Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, okay? Now, that manifests in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. Does it last? Well, no, clearly not. There is no more unified Islamic vision in the world like there was in those days. So I got a couple of names tossed at me here. I'm going to try and take them more or less in order. So I see Safavids and I see Mughals and I see Ottomans. So let's just do all three together. These are your gunpowder empires. Before all of them, though, was the earliest Islamic empire, which was the four rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun. And then you've got the Umayyads, who murder Ali, seize control, and establish a hereditary monarchy that becomes the next empire of Islam. They last until there's an internal revolt by the House of Abbas. The House of Abbas being one of the noble governing families of the Islamic world under the under the Umayyads. And the House of Abbas launches this revolt, seizes control of Damascus, the capital, murders all of the royal family of the Umayyads except for one. The one guy survives, flees all the way to Spain, and establishes his own thing there. Move him aside for now. He's out of the picture. The House of Abbas, led by Abbas, becomes the Abbasids, the Abbasid dynasty. And they will rule as Islam's new caliphs until, so politically, 1000 CE, maybe 150 years. Remember, Islam has a problem when it comes to succession. Remember, Muhammad never gave any rules as to who should run the show when he's gone. So they never figured that out. This resulted in murder and assassination from the very beginning. You heard those stories. And this was true especially in the highest levels of society. For the competition for the next sultan or the next caliph or whatever was always going to be somebody's going to get murdered, pushed down a flight of stairs, drink some poison, accidentally fall onto a knife, whatever it might be. So this was the result of all that. The political power of the Abbasid caliphs fades relatively quickly. They stay religiously important right until the moment when the Mongols show up 1290. You'd have to look it up, 1285, something like that. And they sweep in and smash the what's left of the Abbasid dynasty. It's really not the Abbasids anymore. There's a number of different Islamic kingdoms, but there is an Abbasid caliph sitting in the city of Baghdad, built by the Abbasids, actually. And in that city of Baghdad is where that last Abbasid caliph dies in battle. So that's it. There's no more Abbasids. There's no more singular caliph until you have your gunpowder empires. Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. Now, no serious Muslim ever considered the Mughal emperors to be caliph of anything. They're non-Arab Muslims ruling northern India. Like, it's just the juice isn't there to make that claim. The Safavids were Shia Muslims, remember, led by that kid who was in hiding for his entire life, right? And he rises to this, he creates a state out of nothing, to give him a lot of credit. I mean, you couldn't do it. And they believe that he's the descendant of Ali. He's the Imam of the Shia, which is different from Imam, the generic term used to describe a religious scholar in Sunni Islam. So this guy that we'll call him the Emperor of the Safavids, he, by definition, is challenging the power of any other Islamic ruler. That includes the Ottoman Emperor. They have it out. The Ottomans eventually win. I mean, I'm making a long history very simple, but the Ottomans eventually win. They win so much they become this massive empire, actually rivaling the size of the earliest and largest Islamic empires. And the Sultan of the Ottomans was seen from that point forward as the de facto caliph of Islam. So the Ottomans reestablished this idea of an Islamic world mission for the first time, and I mean, give them some 400 years, give or take, before this was like really a thing. Maybe a little bit longer. And the Ottomans will be there, as you know, right until the end of World War One. I mean, so they'll be in different carnations. They'll slowly shrink over time, but that's the Ottomans for the most part. All right, what else? The Mughals, we did that. Gandhi and Mandela. Okay, how do I want to do that? And China since the 1900s. Let's do China since the 1900s, since I just was talking about China, and then we'll do Gandhi and Mandela, because they are not really similar. Okay, so back to our China story. Boxer Rebellion's over. Europeans have captured the capital of Beijing. They eventually kind of let it whatever, because they got their own problems with World War I brewing, and they're out of there. There is a revolution in China that puts, as I said, a Chinese republic in place. Not to be confused with the People's Republic of China, which is the current communist state, but a Chinese republic. Led very briefly by a guy named Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was in exile from the Qing rule, had been a revolutionary, an educated man, Western educated, so on. We kind of briefly discussed him in class. Now, these are parts we haven't gotten to in the course, so listen up. The Japanese, if I have to throw a date on it, I'd have to probably Google it. Let me Google it real quick. When did the Japanese invade China for the first time? See, the Japanese invade Korea, and Manchuria. That's important. So, no, not that one. I don't want that. That's the wrong one. 1931, I want to say 1932. 1931, they finished their conquest of Korea. That's important, right? So let me explain why it's important. Where the hell did my stream go? Here I am. So, 1931-ish, Japan has, I think even before then they had already started the invasion. In fact, I'm fairly certain they did. Japan invades Korea. Now, this is not the invasion done by the old samurai warlords. That was attempted. That was a failure. This is modern Japan. You have to know the Japan part of this to understand the modern Chinese part, because they're totally intertwined at this point. So, Japan had what was called the Meiji Restoration, late 1800s. And what it did, in effect, is a series of forward-thinking samurai families, growing business class, middle class people who had no social rank, decide that they want to eliminate the Tokugawa shogunate, seize control of government by elevating the emperor from being a Japanese puppet, like the Japanese emperor was a puppet, right? And making them the actual center of government again, which hadn't been done in, 1,000 years plus. So that's the plan. They accomplished this, in effect. There is an internal revolution in China, in Japan, that it's weird because theoretically the shogun rules in the name of the emperor. So you can't be shogun if the emperor doesn't say so. But as we talked about, if you speak up, you get thrown out of a window, right? So the emperor is not really going to say, oh, no, the shogun's not allowed to be shogun. Yeah, sure, he'll die. So regardless, sparing a lot of details, the samurai class is abolished. They're gone. Instead, the government is now run by bureaucrats who eagerly recruit Western European help. This process is really, really critical because Japan takes a whole different trajectory. China and the Ottomans resist modernization. Even though the Ottomans had modern weapons in the time of World War One, they resisted fully the integration of Westernization. And that included all the Western ideas, all the Western sciences, and things like that. They resisted it. This was a mistake because what it meant was the rest of the world, which was militarily aggressive, was going to surpass you. And you were going to be literally bringing knives to a gunfight. Now, as I said, the Ottomans had modern weaponry, but it became a real mismatch of power. That very much was what something Japan saw happen in China, and they did not want to see it happen to them. So this new emerged class of businessmen and former samurai families decide to basically become something like capitalists, where they'll take their names and they'll take their wealth and they'll combine them and they'll form corporations. And these corporations are meant to work hand in hand with this new government, the Meiji government, the government of the emperor, to modernize Japan and give it an advanced Western feel. Not just for the sake of feeling Western, but to advance the cause of the nation. Now, something Japan's always done is selective borrowing, which is to say the Japanese will take ideas they like, this has been happening since the Middle Ages, and keep only the parts they like. So if you give the Japanese a recipe for a meal, if there's parts of that recipe they don't like, they just chuck it and replace with their own parts or make it as they like it. That's Japan in a nutshell. They selectively borrow. Whereas the Chinese reject everything, right? Ethnocentrism. Japanese don't. The Japanese will take the parts they like and reject the parts they don't. The same was true here in this modern era. So Japan took the elements of modernization they really, really liked and they incorporated them. They rejected the parts they weren't so keen on. For example, there wasn't a real huge drive towards Christianization. Okay? They didn't have any interest in the missionary drive of things. But they were interested in things like hiring retired American Civil War officers from the Union and say, hey, come to Japan and train our troops on how to fight a modern battle with modern equipment. They paid the Germans to build modern factories. They paid the British to help them establish modern Japanese railways and put up a modern electrical grid. They did all this. Now, they did this on government money. Where they get the money from? They seized it from Japanese families that had it in the form of the stripping of the samurai of their privileges and power. So they became a cooperative element between the Japanese government and the Japanese businesses. And before long, it was very difficult to distinguish between the two. This becomes a form of fascism. This is a crony capitalism where the businesses are working hand in hand with government and combine this with what is a driving ultra-nationalist sentiment, which ironically, as you move forward in this timeline of, say, the late 1800s to the 1950s, by the time you get to the 1950s, rather than rejecting the past, the Japanese government is telling its people, you need to be like samurai. You need to act like samurai. You need to have that mentality. They give their Japanese officers swords, for example. This is going to be very interesting as well when we get to China in a minute. So this is what's going on. But to do all that, to be factories, to have ships, to have modern equipment, to have a modern military, you need resources. If you want to be an industrial power, you need resources. And we talked about Japan is literally this sort of busted flush of geography in world history. They're a tiny island, 80% mountains, with almost no natural resources in those mountains. It's a total bust. So if you want to actually be an industrial power, you got to get resources. You could buy them. That's expensive. Instead, they targeted what they could take over. And the absence of European focus in the region, they sweep around the Pacific, snatching up various islands, eventually even attacking the U.S. in World War II, right, and taking Hawaii, and so or attempting to destroy our Pacific fleet so they could take the Philippines, Guam, and that whole string of islands. But before any of that, their first target was actually Korea and then later China. They successfully conquer all of Korea and brutalize the Koreans. The Japanese were encouraged to treat all other East Asianers as dogs, as animals, as unworthy of mercy, compassion, or good treatment. This is going to lead to some real horrors, as we'll discuss in China, but it was also bad in Korea. There's still that resentment today in Korea, by the way, between Koreans and Japanese and Chinese and Japanese over what happened in the World War I, World War II era. So when China's in the middle of this civil war we were discussing, where the government's all busted up and no one's really running anything, and this warlord and that warlord is happening again, This is perfect opportunity. Japan sweeps in and takes most of the coast of China, just conquers it. And they hold it for quite a while. In the middle of that, a struggle for power has broken out in interior China between two rival groups, the Nationalist Party, which was Sun Yat-sen's party before he basically left government. He was pretty much a failure. I mean, he's revered in China, and I gotta be honest with you, I still don't really know why. I mean, he's like a failure. I mean, nothing. He was voted in and seen as a philosophically important person, but if you look at his accomplishments, there really aren't any. I mean, I don't know to this day why, other than propaganda, why he should be viewed as such a great leader in the history of China. I mean, his whole scheme went to hell in a handbasket pretty quickly. But nevertheless, his party, the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang Party, ended up more or less consolidating power in the country against the other rival faction that had emerged, and that was communists. Now, these communists were led by Mao Zedong, and they're fighting it out when the Japanese sweep in. This was a weird sort of dynamic because it actually gave a reason for the communists and the nationalists to stop fighting each other and to turn on the Japanese. Now, this was kind of a problem. The nationalists were technically the government, the legal government of China at the time. So they had a moral, legal, and ethical obligation to fight the Japanese and repel them. The communists were a revolutionary force against the nationalists. And Mao was wise enough, scummy enough, make your pick, to let the nationalists take on a huge burden of the fighting against the Japanese. Now, that doesn't go very well for the Chinese. The Japanese, as I said, take over almost the entire Chinese coastline. Most famous of their various atrocities, and there were many. I told you the Japanese treated people who were not Japanese, even East Asianers, like dogs. And very famously and very horribly was an incident known as the Rape of Nanking. One of those things that you really do need to know. The Rape of Nanking involved the Chinese government, the local Chinese government of the city of Nanking, that same city that was taken by the Taiping Rebellion not that long ago. So they've seen some hell for the last 100 years. They're about to see a lot worse. They try to basically, the Japanese give them one chance. They say, surrender or you're going to get it. Surrender the city. The leader says, well, no, we can't do that. Sorry. So they prepare a final stand to try to protect the city from the invading Japanese army. It's a waste. They're overrun quickly. From the moment they're overrun, the Japanese army is encouraged, not just given free rein, is encouraged to brutalize the entire city population. There are first-hand accounts that I can't put on YouTube, or this will get flagged and probably put down, that literally talk about the intense, graphic, and horrific ways in which people were raped with objects by multiple people and then murdered constantly. You know, soldier broke into a house. There's a 5-year-old girl who somehow survives this encounter. Her mother, her sister, and her grandmother are all gang raped by Japanese and stabbed to death. There's many accounts like this. They're really, really ugly. There was a contest, official contest, printed and reported on in Japan in a Japanese newspaper between two Japanese officers who decided they were going to have a contest to see which of them could kill more Chinese in Nanking, that city, Nanjing, same place, with their swords. Because I told you the officers were given samurai swords, katana. So rather than use guns or anything like it, they had a contest as to who could go around the city. And it was just like any random civilian. It was like who could step on more ants. And they cut down 100 each or so civilians. They lost count, so they couldn't figure out who won the contest. So instead, they had round 2. And round 2 had each of them accompanied by several other officers of the other guy's unit to confirm how many had been killed. And these guys went around the city just hacking people down. I mean, one guy won with a final count on round 2 of 106 dead with his sword, and the other guy had 105 dead. And there's a picture of them posed leaning on their swords like they're great heroes, having butchered civilians by literally the hundreds, these two men. And this is just two guys that decide to have a little bit of fun murdering a bunch of Chinese civilians with their swords. But this is not 1400, 1300, 1200. This is the 1930s, 1940s, 1930s. This is not ancient history. This is like yesterday in world history standards. This has just happened. So, again, human capacity for brutality against each other is something that I wanted you to sort of pick up on in the Holocaust Museum today. It wasn't just a trip to learn about the Holocaust. It was about the generic idea that humans are capable of extraordinary brutality. And it's not constrained to peoples of an ancient time. Modern world is extraordinarily brutal. So, not being brutal is the actual exception. Okay. From there, China ends up basically World War II ends, and we'll kind of stop there because I got to go to something else. But the long story short is the Chinese communists will eventually win this whole thing. They'll win the whole thing, and they'll establish themselves, and they've been in charge in China ever since 1947, 44, 45. You can look it up if you want, something like that. Jillian, Aztec and Inca empires. Okay, you don't need to know a whole lot, but you need to know a couple things. The most important thing is they're always going to make sure you understand that just because they're Stone Age cultures, and just because in an era where Europeans were sailing across the oceans and had steel weaponry and had gunpowder weaponry, that even though they were technologically inferior, they were still a complex society that were heavily organized, had complex systems of government, complex religions, and complex architecture. So they always want you to sort of come to the conclusion that these are not barbarians, these are not savages. They are complex people, limited by the fact that they did not have the same levels of interconnectivity that the Eastern Hemisphere had. And as a result, they didn't share the same levels of technology, and as a result, they didn't grow as quickly technologically. But nevertheless, they were still complex civilizations. Beyond that, I wouldn't expect to see much else. South America stuff and trends. Can you please go over the Russian Revolution? All right, so let's talk about South America stuff and trends, whatever the hell that means, right? Because we are already in Aztec and Inca empires. Okay, I assume what he means is what happened to South America? Like what happened to Central America? So here's the basic story, and it is basic. It's too basic, but basic enough. New Spain, the Spanish colony, is effectively all of South America and all of Central America. We should all know that by now, plus a bunch of Caribbean islands and Florida and a few other places. Okay. As Napoleon smashes Spain, captures it, conquers it, Habsburg control in the Western Hemisphere vanishes. Theoretically, these are theoretically now French colonies because the French monarch Napoleon now owns Spain. But that doesn't really happen. The Haitian Revolution, only successful slave revolution in world history, shatters that notion because there's no more major port. The French have lost their major sort of source of connectivity to that region. So from that point forward, the sort of threads of independence start to form. Mexico becomes independent on its own from Spain. Brazil's, one of its sort of crown monarchs, chooses to move to Brazil and rule from Brazil rather than rule from Portugal. And ends up becoming the king of Brazil in effect, and that is how they become independent. The rest of South America gets their independence much earlier than the rest of any other colonized people do. Well, that's not true. I guess the United States would have been first. But shortly thereafter, in that period of the 1800s, you get Simon Bolivar and the various movements of what I'll call South American whites against Europeans. So there was this class of people in all of the Spanish New World called the Creoles. And the Creoles were white people, white guy, white woman. And if you remember, there were the castas system, which was very, very, very detailed racially, where you rank based on how much your racial profile was. You know, how much native, how much black, how much Spanish, how much European Spanish, and so on. So a peninsulare was the highest in the casta system. This was a Spaniard born from two Spanish parents who had both been born in the peninsula, hence peninsulare, been born in the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal back in Europe. In the New World, if you were born from two European parents, but you dropped out of mom in the New World, you were not of the same social rank. You were a Creole. This was seen by Creoles over time as ridiculous and unfair racial distinction. Notice they didn't mind racial distinction. They minded being considered a lesser class of white folk than the European Spaniards. So this led to resentment and eventually to revolution. So a guy like Simón Bolívar was a white guy. Bolívar was a Creole who led a series of revolutionary movements supported by mulattoes, mestizos, which are mixed race blacks with Spaniards, and mixed race, I shouldn't say Spaniards, whites with blacks, and then mixed race native Indians with whites, who represented a large population of the poor sort of farming class of the New World. And there were lots of farmers. Remember, this is cash crop land, right? Your sugar cane, your cotton, whatever, tobacco. So they led a series of revolutions here. And Simón Bolívar was the head of most of this. He's remembered as this guy who promoted democracy. If you read a lot of his writings, especially early on, he's talking about freedom and enlightenment and the Enlightenment theories of Europe, that John Lockean idea of life, liberty, and property belonging to every human being, is the source of the justification for these revolutions. For what it's worth, I don't know if it'll come up in the AP exam, Simón Bolívar later in his life wanted to form all of this into one sort of mega state that he wanted to call Grand Colombia. And when it was clear that the various different regions that become today's South American countries did not want to do that, he tried to make it happen. Like, he forgot democracy. He became a dictator. He became a guy who tried to exercise his new powers as president of this Grand Colombia to force compliance in people. So for a man who talked a lot about democratic ideals and democratic freedoms and democratic identities, he actually ends his life really as a despot, as somebody who's trying to push his own ideas even at the expense of the principles that once brought him to power where he was. So that kind of sets up modern-ish South America. Russian Revolution. Yeah, hang on, Riley. We'll get to that in a minute when we get back to Europe. Green Revolution and what happened after World War II. Turn the mic up. I'm just scrolling down here. See what other stuff is on the list. Okay, not much else. So we need to go some of the Unit 9. Yeah, search them. We can do that. Absolutely. How many people are still in the thing? 14. All right. We'll go for like another 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll probably stop. So what I want to do is hit the... we did opium trade. Did this stuff. Unit 9. All right, so let's do this. Let's real quick do Green Revolution, because it does have something to do with South America. And then we'll talk about the Russian Revolution, and we'll kind of end it there, because Berlin Wall is a little very, very, very modern, which is fine. I don't mind that. But let's save that for next week, because we'll do 2 more streams next week too. So we'll save the very, very modern stuff for next week once we have a chance to talk about it a little bit in class. Okay, so let's talk about Green Revolution. The Green Revolution. This is the important part. You need to eliminate from your brain this idea that the Green Revolution was some sort of hippie movement, tree huggers, save the planet. It was the opposite. So every time you go to the supermarket now, and it's organic, farm raised, pasture raised, free range, non-GMO, no hormones, organic, etc. That is anti-Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was the movement to put into the hands of what we sometimes call the third world or the developing world, which are basically poor countries, to put into their hands chemicals, pesticides, hormones, fertilizers, with one goal in mind, and that is to produce stronger, larger, and more effective crop yields. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The privilege to choose to be poorer as a people in order to pursue a world you'd rather live in is a privilege of the rich. And you are rich. Yes, you. If you live in America, 88% of all Americans are in the top 2% of all global wealth. You are probably in the top 88% of all Americans. Therefore, you are rich. And it's easy for you to say, I can pay $2 more, $3 more for organic bread. I can pay 3 times as much for farm-raised, pasture-fed, free-range chicken eggs. Great. Good for you. You're not, like me, in any danger of starving. If you're in India today, modern India, sorry, I just came too close to the camera. It's going to take a second to refocus. There are still people starving in India today. And it's like the 7th or 8th richest country in the world. There are still people starving in China today. And they're the 2nd richest country in the world. And you might say there are still people starving in America today. Yeah, but there shouldn't be. Like we have, if someone like me can exist, then there should be no one that starves. Like theoretically, there should be no one that starves. We're the richest nation on planet Earth, richest nation that's ever been. So we have the ability, because of that extraordinary wealth, to make decisions that don't make sense. What do I mean by don't make sense? Well, objectively, if I could have 1,000 bushels of food or 500 bushels of food, you should always choose 1,000 bushels. Like, why wouldn't you do that? Right? If I can have a farm and the farm can raise 1,000 bushels of corn, or I could choose to do a different method and get 500 bushels of corn, why would I ever choose 500? And the answer is, you would choose 500 if you believe those 500 bits of corn are maybe providing some other benefit. They're environmentally sustainable. They are organic. There's less pesticides. Whatever it might be. But again, you're rich enough to make that distinction. Let's go and take a different situation. Let's say you're in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's say you're in India. Let's say you're in Southeast Asia. Let's say you're in some poor countries in Africa, in South and Central America. And a significant number of your people, every single day, do not have enough calories to sustain their bodies. They're living in a state of starvation. Is it moral and okay for society to go, yeah, but we have to save the planet, therefore, we will not feed you? And if you assume, well, you can do both, you should read out what scarcity is. You can't do both. So, poor countries in the 1930s, 1940s, and to be fair, right up to the modern day, really, but yeah, really, engaged in what was called the Green Revolution, where, no, we will use pesticides to kill creatures that will otherwise eat our crops. We will use hormones to make cows grow fatter and produce more milk. We will use fertilizers that will make our crops grow larger than they otherwise naturally could ever do. Why? Because starvation is a greater evil than the various goods you think you're getting by reducing our crop yields. So it's the idea of you do put the hormones in, you do use GMOs, you do not go organic, you do factory farm the chickens. You absolutely do. And the reason why you do that is because it makes more food for everyone. That's why you do that. And again, it's a thing where poor countries did to avert death through starvation. It was wildly successful along these lines, and is a huge reason why global poverty has dropped so dramatically over the last 100 years. It's because we, as Westerners, provided that technology to those people to allow them to create those crop yields. Now, this has the sort of knock-on effect of course, having other issues. So, does India have a pollution problem? Yes. Does China have a pollution problem? Yes, it does. Are they eating the same quality of chicken egg you might be if they're getting it from factory farmed chickens? Well, if you go to the supermarket and buy the cheapest eggs, you're probably getting something very similar to what they're getting. Okay? If you instead buy the farm-raised pasture eggs, you're probably paying 4x, 5x, maybe slightly less the price of a typical egg, but you do get a better egg, higher quality egg, an egg with less modifications to it, with, unknown necessarily effects, less microplastics, that kind of stuff in your body. But that's what the Green Revolution is. It's not nature first. It's the opposite. It's a revolt of humanity controlling the planet through its scientific technologies to produce more food for everyday poor humans around the world. That's what it did. Well, I think I just answered your question, Ray, about cause and effect of the Green Revolution. All right, we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, and we're going to try and do this in like 5-10 minutes. It's going to be impossible to do, but I'll do my best. I think from that point forward, we will probably call it after that for tonight. Okay, Russian Revolution. Simplest way to sort of summarize it is the Tsar of Russia led the armies of World War I's Russia against the Germans after it was clear the Germans were destroying the Russians. The Russians were ill-equipped to fight World War I. The Tsar was a nincompoop, had no idea how to run a military, and did no better than his incompetent generals. And in the end, he's being defeated. At the same time, his court back home in St. Petersburg, it has fallen into chaos. They've let this guy named Rasputin into the court. He's this weird dude. If you ever watch a Disney movie, you might know who he is, or at least something of what he is. If you Google him, you'll be like, oh my God, creepy dude. But basically, the Russian court thinks he's some kind of a wizard or a sorcerer or an antichrist, and they think he's poisoning the queen's ear, maybe even have seduced the queen, maybe has put a spell on the Tsar, and he needs to be killed. So he's murdered. It's a long story, and the whole court falls into disarray. In the middle of all this, in the absence of any competent leadership, Russia becomes the home of the world's most successful movements of socialists. Now, socialists are people, we talked about authoritarianism a little bit. Socialists are people who want to see everybody treat the community as one, or treat society as one community, one social movement where everybody shares everything. There is no ownership of property. I don't own this shirt. I don't own this tea. I don't own this computer. I don't own that camera. You don't own your underwear. All right? Instead, there'd be some means, and if you're a socialist, you believe that these means would emerge organically. People would do this as a natural consequence of the evolution of culture and the evolution of thought, is what Marxists believe would happen. People would just come to these conclusions on their own, that people would eventually say, okay, we should share in everything. Because, like I said, there are poor people out there, right? And I exist, and I'm not poor. So if there's somebody starving, and I'm fat, I should stop eating as much food and give some of my food to the poor, starving person. I will get thinner. They will not starve. Win-win. Like, that's a socialist attitude, right? The problem is, the idea that human beings will arrive at this system on their own is wrong. It's never happened in any kind of scale anywhere. And so, therefore, what instead is invented, and it is a Russian invention, is the idea of the revolutionary vanguard. Now, a vanguard is a military term for the people at the front of the army. They're the vanguard. They're the ones who go before the main army. So they're the bringers of the army. They're the ones who sort of show up. They're the spear tip, basically, of the army. Now, these revolutionary vanguard were not actually military men. For the most part, they were nerds. They were academics. Most famous of which in Russia is a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who's a real piece of human trash. And what they believed was you were never going to get Marx's kumbaya revolution, where the average person says the hell with the system, and we all join together and throw off our shackles and kill the rich and take their stuff and share it all. And Lenin's like, it's never going to happen. So what has to happen instead is somebody has to actually drag society there kicking and screaming. And it needs to be people who are educated in this stuff. They know where these are people who believe Marx is right, that waiting for Marx's vision to occur on its own is never going to happen, so we have to drag it there. We have to drag society in the vision of Marx kicking and screaming. The problem, of course, is this is the definition of authoritarianism, right? If I believe that my vision for the world is the correct vision, and I'm willing to steal from you the right to say you don't agree, and I'm going to make you agree, that's authoritarianism, right? Because, of course, if you really disagree, I have to use force on you. I have to use violence on you to get compliance. So this is exactly what happens. So what you get is the emergence of what was called communists. Now, communists, simply put, are people who recognize that the socialist vision of the world coming to a collective sharing of all property is never going to happen. So someone has to make it happen. Communism is the idea that this must be the community, the commune, must be forced upon society via intellectuals forming a leadership structure of a state that are going to force society to be socialist. This is one of the most hellish incarnations of human thought in history. The number of dead who have come about from the attempt to force humans to be as willing to give of themselves to strangers as communism and socialism might suggest they should, has been nothing but a river of blood for the last 110 years. And it starts in Russia, where the Russian Revolution brings eventually into power the Communist Party, what was called the Bolshevik Party, which was the most extreme communist that existed in Russia. And one of their first things they do is begin to liquidate, which is a nice way of saying eliminate, murder, kill, anyone in Russia that had any kind of property. And this included especially small farmers that had had any kind of success at farming. This was an official class in the Russian society known as a kulak. A kulak was a farmer who owned 8 acres of land. Now, 8 acres of land may sound like a lot, but if you think about farmland, I don't know. Google it. How many acres is Harb's farm? How many acres is Fink's farm? I don't know. I bet you it's more than 8 acres, okay? So we're talking about a modest size of land that they own. Now, they might own a small herd of cattle. They might own 1 or 2 buildings on there. They probably employ other Russians to help farm their 8 acres of land. But let's not pretend these guys are like, U.S. agricorps that are running, massive farming operations. These are farmers that probably generationally were the best farmers in their community. They had techniques, ideas, sales techniques, sales patterns, something that allowed them to accumulate a little bit of wealth. And they purchased or inherited or married into other people's lands. And boom, they became a kulak with their 8 acres of land or more. For the Russians, this was the first. For the communists, this was the first group that had to go. And the reason they picked this group is because it was the easiest method. Any authoritarian state, communist, fascist, you name it, one of the first things they'll do is tell you who your enemy is. And so what do? I go to poor people and I say, you know who made you poor? The rich. That's what I do. I take you, I say you're the group that's suffering. And I point you at the group that's making you suffer. And of course it's not me. It's not me. I'm on your side. Yeah, I'm rich, but don't worry about that. I'm on your side. So what are we going to do? What we're going to do is we're going to go take that guy's land. Now, of course, Ted the Kulak is not going to give you his land. So we'll kill him. That's fine. That's actually good. It's morally good, actually, because he is the oppressor. Yeah, I know he's a farmer like you. I know he still steps in horse crap every day like you do. I know that. But he's the wealthiest farmer in your town, which makes him evil. Why? Because Marx said so. And I'm the guy who says that Marx is right. And I'm going to make society believe Marx is right, whether society wants to or not. And of course, if I go to a bunch of poor people and I say, your enemy is the rich, kill them. Sure, why not? Especially if I told a bunch of people, hey, you know why you suck? Because of that group. You know why you're suffering? Because of that group. Hey, I go to the other group. You know why you're suffering? That group. That's a great way of making people hate each other, murder each other, kill each other, genocide each other. It's happening every single day. So that idea of authoritarianism, picking a group, picking a thing, picking a concept and saying those are the enemy, there you go. In communism, the enemy is anyone with wealth of any kind. Anyone with property of any kind. And of course, the promise is, well, once we kill that bastard, once we kill Ted, and we take his land, well, everybody's going to share this land. Everybody's going to share it. So it's all our land now. The problem is when nobody owns something, nobody owns something. So if you don't own it, I don't own it. So why am I going to work my ass off for this thing on this plot of land that I don't get to keep the produce of? So it's actually a terrible system. And of course, it results in murder, right? Inevitably, because of course you're going to run out of kulaks. And they do run out of kulaks because they do kill like 5 million of them. And then you're going to run out of the best farmers in your society. And all of a sudden you're having famines because the farmers that remain, it turns out, weren't producing anywhere near the amount of crops that the kulaks were. Why? Because that's how production works. 80% of the production is coming from 50% of the workers. So all of a sudden you find that, oh, whoops, we just killed the most productive farmers, the ones who knew how to farm most effectively, that had the best techniques. That's why they had made the most money. That's why they had a little bit of land. So now the people left over are not the best. They're not even that competent necessarily. Some of them might actively be bad at farming. And we're forcing them to farm in a way that we think makes sense because it subscribes to communist ideology. And it doesn't make any sense. And now people are starving. So we've killed another 20 million people because why the hell not, right? If they starve to death, the hell with them, right? And that's how you get communism in the Soviet state. And anywhere you get communism, you're going to get a very similar story. You'll get it in Mao's China, where he has the Great Leap Forward, which was actually a massive step backwards that ends up murdering, again, some 100 million of his own people through starvation, oppression, systematic, secret police murders, arrests, show trials, you name it. So this is where the Russian Revolution gets you. It gets you the communist state that is otherwise known as the Soviet Union. Okay, that was again a whirlwind tour. All right, I don't see any new questions. We're down to 13 folks. That's an unlucky number, so I think we're going to stop there. Thanks. We'll do this again on Thursday. We'll focus on the writing skills on Thursday. And then next week, we'll probably repeat the same schedule, a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, and we'll do more content or whatever seems to be coming up in class that we need to do. And we'll probably do one of these again the night before the AP exam as well. All right? So thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a good one, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.